This may surprise some of you, but many people describe me as white. That's not usually how I like to identify myself. I like to be identified by my name. My name is Mr. Beat. Anyway, poverty. I would say I have not experienced that much poverty in my life. I've been pretty lucky. Still, growing up, my parents did live paycheck to paycheck. They had a lot of debt, although they did hide this stuff from us kids. It was only later in life that I figured it out. Still, I had a pretty good life. I had stability. I almost always felt safe. My needs were met. Not one, but two adults always were around who loved me and looked out after me. I even learned about some stuff growing up. I got to go to a private elementary school and later a public middle school and high school to get a decent education. I remember learning about American slavery and the civil rights movement in both 7th grade and 11th grade. Learning about legendary folks like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, Rosa Parks, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. When I began applying for colleges, I learned that many folks who had a different skin color than me apparently got scholarships because of their skin color. And this, frankly, confused me. This seemed like discrimination. Why was a group of people getting special treatment because of the color of their skin? Heck, dare I say, isn't that racist? Well, hold up, let's get the trusty dictionary out to look up the definition of racism. Racism. The belief that humans can be divided into so-called biological groups called races, and that certain races are inferior or superior to other races. Notice how the word races is in quotes, because it's a word invented by humans to justify hierarchies. To find out more about all this, I highly recommend the Cynical Historian's video, Race is a Social Construct. To oversimplify that video though, one group of people decided they were better than other groups of people, and to justify that they were better, they brought up genetic differences that we see through appearance differences. The most common way they did this was dividing people up based on the color of their skin. That doesn't mean that human variations do not exist. Some of us are really tall. Some of us have green eyes. Some of us have really hairy backs. But differences in genetic traits doesn't mean race has any biological basis. Anyway, what the heck was I talking about? Oh yeah, I was reminiscing about my past. I remember being annoyed as someone with European ancestry, not getting scholarships for having European ancestry if others could get scholarships based on their ancestry. Regardless, I got over it pretty quickly. After all, I was taught not to be racist, to not judge others
by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Yeah, that. I knew that those with lighter skin had historically had a huge advantage around the world. Not only that, in college, I learned the importance of this thing called affirmative action. Affirmative action, aka positive discrimination, means favoring folks belonging to groups previously discriminated against. In the United States, most of the groups previously discriminated against were what we today call people of color. Simply put, a person of color just means a non-white person. Yeah, I'm not a person of color. And so, beginning in the 1960s, which just so happened to be the same time a bunch of really important civil rights laws passed, institutions and governments began to create affirmative action programs to help people of color have an equal opportunity because, as it turns out, they often needed special treatment to even get a fair chance in life.
But freedom is not enough. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair.
In 2008, I remember being proud that Americans had finally elected the first African-American president. Heck, I even thought that racism may just be on its way out. And then I heard of this thing called systemic racism, and I was like, well, crap. Systemic racism is when a group of people have less opportunities, not because of individuals being racist, but entire systems being racist. These systems are often either political, economic, or social systems, and they're also often connected. It's different from individual racism, aka personal racism, the more explicit form of racism in which individuals are racist, or even institutional racism, in which large and important organizations are racist. Today, those two forms are indeed less common than they were in the 1960s. But a lot of people deny that systemic racism exists. Wait, what?
The United States does not have systemic racism.
There is no such thing as systemic racism. Stop feeling guilty. It doesn't exist.
I think there's individual racism, but the idea that there's widespread systemic racism does not exist.
Okay. There is no systemic racism in this country. Dr. King eliminated that with the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act.
Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist.
But hold on, whoever that dude with the expensive suit speaking at Oxford was doesn't know the definition of systemic racism. Remember, the definition of systemic racism is when a group of people has less opportunities due to entire systems being racist. It's not
laws in place that treat black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently.
No, the laws are pretty much fine. Again, we mostly fixed all that back in the 1960s. At least in the United States. It's the enforcement of the law. See, that's an example of how the criminal justice system has been racist.
Systemic racism, that charge, is a ruse, and it's to say everything in our country is infected. Every institution, every system, from the top to the bottom, from the beginning to the end, it's all infected.
Everything in our country is infected.
I am making this video because a lot of people still deny that systemic racism exists. And it's almost always because they don't even understand the definition of systemic racism. It's like not believing the tooth fairy is real and then describing the tooth fairy as a giant bunny who delivers eggs on Easter. Unfortunately, systemic racism is indeed real. And to prove it, I'm going to give you the most common examples of it. But first, this video was sponsored once again by Ground News, a website and app created by a former NASA engineer to help you get an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting. All backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. Here's an example, the Jeffrey Epstein Unsealed Documents story. Ground News summarizes what lots of different media outlets are saying about it from all sides of the political spectrum. It's all in one place. Nice. You can see that of the 46 news sources covering the story, 5 lean to the left, 8 lean to the right, and 27 are in the center. 75% of the sources have high factuality, but just 10% of the sources are independent news, which means they are sources free from both government and corporate influence. But my favorite part is the blind spot feed, which shows you which stories have been underreported by either side of the political spectrum. I appreciate this because it quickly reveals echo chambers. As I've said many times before on this channel, Ground News has dramatically helped me navigate the media landscape, and I highly encourage all of you to try it out as well. I have a link. There it is on the screen right now. If you use that link, you'll get 30% off of Ground News's all-access Vantage subscription. Clicking the link in the description of this video helps support an independent news platform helping to make the media landscape more transparent. Ground News, baby. Okay, so how do we know systemic racism is real? First, remember that the goal for human beings is to survive and reproduce. This is more likely to happen if our needs are all met. We always hear about the starting line metaphor as if life is a race to see who is the fastest. You know, white people are at the starting line, but often people of color are way back behind the starting line, so they need extra help to get to the starting line so they have a chance to win the race. But that metaphor assumes that life is a zero-sum game, that only one person can win the race. That's why I like my tree metaphor better. Imagine an apple tree that produces an infinite amount of apples. In this metaphor, getting those apples is the ultimate prize. The best thing ever. The thing that will make us happy. And yeah, survive and reproduce. Now, we can't reach those apples. We have to work for them. We may have to climb that tree to get those apples. Or maybe we build a ladder to reach them. The point is, just like the day-to-day struggles of life, we have to work for those apples. But not all of us start from the ground. Some of us have to first climb out of a hole first to even get to the ground. Sometimes some of the people on the ground even kick dirt back in this hole on the people down there. Here are 6 examples of systemic racism, and notice how poverty underlies all of them. The healthcare system has hurt people of color more than others. People of color are less likely to be in good health. The life expectancy for black men is more than 4 years less than that of white men. People of color are less likely to see a doctor. They are less likely to have good health insurance or health insurance at all. During the COVID-19 pandemic,
COVID-19!
people of color died from the virus at a higher rate than whites. People of color are less likely to be vaccinated. They are less likely to get treatment for mental illness. Black infants are more than 2 times as likely to die as white infants. Black and Hispanic children are more than twice as likely to not have enough food to eat than white children. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related causes than white women. The education system has hurt people of color more than others. Students of color generally have less educational opportunities. They generally do worse on standardized tests. They are less likely to graduate from high school or go to college. When they do go to college, the colleges are lower quality. Black college students owe around $7,000 more in student loan debt than white college students. Students of color have less access to advanced classes. There is evidence that non-black teachers set lower expectations for black students. They are 54% less likely than white students to get recommended for gifted classes. Schools are highly segregated by skin color. Most schools where the majority are students of color are in the inner cities and slums. Because most public schools are funded primarily through property taxes, schools where the majority are students of color are often underfunded compared to majority white schools. The employment system has hurt people of color more than others. Then again, a lot of this is related to the education system. People of color are more likely to be unemployed. They tend to get less job opportunities and worse benefits. In the United States, blacks earn 30% less than whites. The median household income of African Americans is about 1/8 that of the median household income of whites. Blacks are underrepresented in high-paying professions. On average, African American entrepreneurs get $35,000 in loans to start a business versus the $107,000 that whites get. The housing system has hurt people of color more than others. People of color are much less likely to own a house and much more likely to spend a higher percentage of their income on rent. They have a harder time getting loans to buy homes. When they do get loans, they tend to pay higher interest rates. The black home ownership rate is 44%. For whites, it's 74%. People of color generally live in smaller homes. They generally live in less safe neighborhoods, strongly related to the fact that these neighborhoods have concentrated poverty. Here in the United States, the political system has hurt people of color more than others. People of color have more obstacles to voting. In 2016, 1 out of every 13 African Americans couldn't vote due to a felony conviction, compared to 1 out of 56 white Americans. People of color are more likely to have to wait in line to vote. They're more likely to have trouble finding their polling location and finding a time to vote. They are less likely to have an ID to vote. As I already mentioned, the criminal justice system has hurt people of color more than others. There's no evidence whatsoever that people of color use or sell drugs at a higher rate than whites. Yet, they get arrested much more and then get harsher prison sentences. Black males get federal sentences around 20% longer than white males for the exact same crime. People of color are more likely to get stopped and frisked and harassed by police officers. In the United States, blacks are between 2 to 4 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. Do blacks commit more crimes in the United States? Well, they get arrested more, is all we know. Keep in mind that the majority of arrests are drug-related. Now, do blacks commit more violent crimes? According to the data, yes, but that data is often insufficient and misleading. Also, folks conveniently leave out the fact that most of that is due to gang violence, and gang violence is rooted in, you guessed it, poverty. Being in poverty is perhaps the strongest predictor of whether or not someone will commit a crime. You see, desperate people often resort to desperate measures in order to survive.
Disparities do not mean systemic racism. Disparities mean disparities.
But what caused those disparities?
A black married man has the same unemployment rate as do whites. What is stopping a black person from going to a college or university?
Poverty?
The things that you mentioned are disparities. Tell me how these disparities are because of racism.
Poverty.
You mentioned mortgage applications. It is true that blacks are turned down at a higher rate for mortgages than whites. It's also true that Asians are turned down less often than whites. How do you explain that?
Generational poverty caused by systemic racism. Again, poverty underlies all of these. And yeah, we must recognize that there's a lot of white folks in poverty as well, including much of my own family. This is why I think the term white privilege does more harm than good, raising awareness about systemic racism, as it tends to downplay the experiences of poor white folks. In reality, we could just as easily call it wealth privilege instead of white privilege. So what caused these 6 examples of systemic racism? The momentum of history. In the early years of the United States, millions of African Americans were enslaved. Even those who were, quote, free were heavily discriminated against. Many forget that Europeans initially enslaved Native Americans. At least hundreds of thousands were driven off their lands. Tens of thousands died in wars and massacres. After slavery ended, governments across the country passed laws that treated African Americans as second-class citizens, stripping them of the same opportunities others had. Meanwhile, the United States government forced Native Americans onto mainly communal reservations. Individuals rarely had property rights. They couldn't own land. This eventually made it difficult for them to establish credit and borrow money. While the Dawes Act of 1887 let most Native Americans own property, it also gave away nearly 2/3 of all Native American land. Holy crap! And allowed rich developers to buy most of the most productive land. Not only that, developers often tricked many Native Americans into selling their land, leaving many of them homeless. The Dawes Act also caused many tribes to lose their culture by shipping their children to boarding schools. Oh, and Native Americans couldn't vote. Even after the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, whites prevented Native Americans from voting in other sneaky ways. African Americans could vote, but they often first had to jump through some hoops to do so. They had to pay poll taxes, take ridiculously difficult tests, or face intimidation from white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Because of this, no African Americans served in Congress between the years 1901 to 1928, despite being between 10 to 12% of the total population at the time. That was also the time when the majority of Confederate statues went up, by the way. A pretty horrific time to be a person of color in America. And that's also when racial violence peaked. Race riots, most infamously the Tulsa Race Massacre. Thousands of African Americans got lynched. Typically how it went down was something bad would happen to a white person, a black person, usually a black man, would get blamed, a mob would kidnap the person blamed, and finally publicly execute them. If you never learned any of this in school, this is the part of the video where you probably just need to stop and ask yourself, why? Why was I never taught this stuff? And then there was housing discrimination, and this was a big one. First of all, it's important to understand the importance of generational wealth. Generational wealth is the passing of wealth down from one generation to the next. Most of it is passed down after a family member dies in the form of an inheritance. Often it's through real estate, and the most common form of real estate passed down is a house. Generational wealth is also passed down in the form of support of a child as they grow up, especially with their educational endeavors. According to one analysis by LendingTree, it costs on average around $237,000 for American parents to raise one child. Woo! According to the economist Thomas Piketty, most wealth, more than 70% of it, is inherited, not earned. Other economists dispute how he came up with that figure, but the fact remains that probably at least half of all wealth in the world is indeed inherited. Not only that, our wealth today can be traced back hundreds of years. But most African Americans and Native Americans only began accumulating wealth within the past few decades. I already mentioned Native Americans struggling due to not being able to own private property, but African Americans, more often than not, also got screwed. Between the Civil War and the 1980s, the US federal government gave nearly 3 million people of European ancestry free land. Okay, well, but sure, African Americans got some of that free land too. Heck, by 1910, more African Americans owned land than at any time before or since. Yep, black ownership peaked in 1910. It's been on the decline ever since. As farming declined, blacks moved to the cities, where they often faced obstacles to buying homes. They were often not allowed to live in nicer, whites-only neighborhoods. One of the most famous early suburban housing developments, Levittown, explicitly refused to sell homes to, quote, non-whites. Even the federal government got in on the racist housing policy. During the Great Depression, which at the time caused more than half of all African Americans to become unemployed, the United States Congress passed 2 laws that made housing more affordable to Americans. But ultimately, most people of color didn't benefit from these laws. Not only that, they led to further segregation, often pushing people of color into public housing slums. Then there was redlining. See the areas on this map highlighted in red? Those were the, quote, risky homes. Banks didn't loan money to the folks in those homes. Insurance companies charged ridiculously high interest rates to the folks in those homes. The folks in those homes tended to be, you guessed it, black. Developers used eminent domain, or the government taking private property for public use, to kick blacks out of their homes. One big example of this was the federal government building interstate highways and splitting black neighborhoods. Most of the laws discriminating against African Americans enforced racial segregation, establishing separate institutions, places, and services for blacks and whites. The United States Supreme Court even upheld racial segregation in the case Plessy v. Ferguson, so long as those institutions, places, and services were, quote, separate but equal. Well, spoiler alert, they were not. 58 years later, the Supreme Court redeemed itself by ruling that racial segregation was, quote, inherently unequal in the famous decision Brown versus the Board of Education. The Brown decision was part of the much bigger civil rights movement, which I mentioned earlier. In addition to desegregation, the civil rights movement saw laws getting rid of all discrimination and obstacles to voting for people of color. Heck, there was even a law that mostly got rid of housing discrimination. Double heck! All of the major reforms of the 1960s and 1970s saw progress not just for African Americans and Native Americans, but additionally Hispanics, Latinos, women, those with disabilities, and even homosexuals. And they all lived happily ever after. Except that they didn't. While most people of color have made tremendous progress in recent decades, overall they still can't seem to escape the momentum of the past. Plus, while the laws and courts were mostly on the side of people of color, racists found ways around the laws and courts to still make people of color second-class citizens. The Nixon administration started the war on drugs, for example, which made pretty much all recreational drugs except alcohol and nicotine illegal. Yep, including marijuana. Folks caught with just marijuana often faced serious prison time that ruined their lives. The war on drugs disproportionately targeted people of color. The Reagan administration took it up a notch, ultimately leading to the United States locking up more people than any other country in the world. Reagan signed the Anti-Drug Act of 1986, which created a minimum prison sentence of 10 years for anyone found distributing 50 grams of crack cocaine or 5,000 grams of powder cocaine. Why just 50 grams of crack cocaine versus the 5,000 of powder cocaine? Well, because it was mostly people of color, poor people in the slums that were the ones doing crack cocaine because it was cheaper than powdered cocaine. Rich people were doing powdered cocaine just as much as the poor people were doing crack cocaine. They're all doing cocaine, but you know, they had to get the poor people. They had to put the poor people and the people of color in prison. People of color often served much longer prison sentences than 10 years for having drugs. People were sentenced to life in prison for, wait for it, just marijuana possession. Life in prison. First-time offenders even began getting maximum sentences for drugs. Because so many people of color had been arrested for drugs, after this, police tended to hang out in slums where people of color lived, actively seeking out non-violent people to arrest them for drugs, as usually it was easier to arrest them than arresting someone, you know, violent. They implemented stop and frisk policies. All of this created even more negative stereotypes of people of color in the media, particularly black men. Racists have also been successful at voter suppression, which mostly hurts low-income folks, which, mostly hurts people of color. Racial gerrymandering, or manipulating districts to weaken the black vote, became more common, as did undoing voter registrations and making it more difficult to register to vote. People of color would often show up to vote and find out that they were no longer registered to vote and then sent away. Not only that, but voting locations and times were reduced to weaken the vote of people of color. And all of this was in the name of supposedly fighting voter fraud. Right. Oh, and all those people of color in prison for drugs that I mentioned earlier? In many cases, they couldn't vote for the rest of their lives! Probably the most surprising thing I found out researching for this video was that de facto segregation still exists. In fact, it exists a lot. Segregation by skin color is worse today than it was in 1990, even though it's no longer written into laws, folks. So what's the solution to overcome these 6 examples of systemic racism? Well, it begins with recognizing systemic racism as a legitimate problem that persists. I'll admit it, I used to downplay systemic racism until I got out of my bubble. Speaking of which, let's get out of my bubble right now. Let's take a walk down memory lane. Behind me is Central High School in Kansas City, Missouri. According to greatschools.org, test scores here fall far below the state average. Pretty much every kid that goes to school here is in poverty. Back in 2010, when I couldn't find a teaching job because of the recession, I substitute taught here. And back then, nearly every kid that went to school here was in poverty too. Huh. Go figure. Often, I was the only white guy in the building. In fact, this is the first time in my life that I remember actually experiencing racism firsthand. Meaning people were racist towards me. And I remember thinking, oh, so that's what it's like to be judged by the color of your skin. This sucks. And it was indeed very tough to teach here. There were some good kids, but there were kids who did act out. But it was only after this experience that I felt that I truly had begun to understand what systemic racism was all about. You see, the kids that go to school here, nearly all of them people of color, go here because they live here. It's not their choice. Now I'm at Blue Valley West High School over in Overland Park, Kansas. According to greatschools.org, test scores here are far above the state average. Most of the kids who go to school here are economically well off. Back in 2010, I would leave my substitute teaching job in Kansas City, Missouri, and drive all the way out here to coach tennis. And guess what? Back then, pretty much every kid here was privileged too. And while it's more ethnically diverse today than it used to be, back in 2010, most of the kids who went to school here happened to have the same skin color as me. I had no behavior issues here, ever. In fact, I had more issues with helicopter parents. So were there no behavior issues because they're mostly white kids? Absolutely not. And it's actually kind of racist to assume that.
How can you argue that racism is not a driving factor in income inequality?
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture.
Yeah, that dude with the tie thinks it's culture, but he's wrong. It's poverty.
Because it has nothing to do with race and everything to do with culture. And when you have a culture that doesn't... And when... You know what? Explain to me. You explain to me why black kids aren't graduating high school.
Poverty?
Explain to me why black kids are shooting each other in rates significantly higher than whites are shooting each other. Explain to me why 13% of the population is responsible for 50% of the murder. Explain
poverty.
Why the number of black kids in prison, not for innocent reasons, not for walking down the street and getting pulled into a prison, is so high.
Oh, yeah, poverty.
It has nothing to do with culture. Explain to me why the single motherhood rate in the black community jumped from 20% to 70%.
Oh, that one's actually the drug war.
Movement has made such tremendous strides.
All those statistics that he lists off are symptoms, not causes. The root cause is poverty. And again, that poverty is caused by the momentum of history.
How do you explain that Chinese Americans who were victimized by racism, how do you explain that they have a higher net income than do whites? How do you explain that Japanese Americans have a higher household income than do whites? How do you explain that Korean Americans have a higher net income than do whites? How do you explain Nigerian Americans have a higher net income, household income than do whites?
I'm glad you brought that up because the vast majority of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Nigerian, and Indian immigrants, while we're at it, all mostly came to the United States since the 1960s, not before it. Also, of all people of color, it's only mostly African Americans and Native Americans that have faced systemic racism with regards to property rights in the past. And finally, there's the single-parent household distinction. 84% of Asian American and Pacific Islander children live with two parents. However, just 58% of Hispanic or Latino children, 51% of Native American children, and 36% of African American children live with two parents. More often than not, single-parent households in the United States are missing a father at home. And where might the fathers be? Well, likely they're in prison as non-violent drug offenders. Say, what does that smell like? Can you smell that? It smells like systemic racism to me. And this is why when we talk about systemic racism in the United States, we're usually talking about either African Americans or Native Americans having the greatest disadvantage. Compared to other groups, they've been screwed over the most throughout American history. Imagine if all white folks got all of their freedoms and property taken away for 200 years, and that during those 200 years, all others viewed white folks as inferior human beings. And then one day, white folks were allowed to have freedoms again and acquire property. Do you think white folks would have an equal opportunity all of a sudden? Do you think that people would just all of a sudden not think of white folks as inferior human beings? No. No, they would not. The momentum of history is why a growing number of people have called for reparations, or giving money to the descendants of people who had their freedom stripped away from them. But that's a whole nother video. Still, the evidence is pretty clear. And I know this may sound mind-blowing, but if people of color had more money, then they could overcome systemic racism. You think Oprah Winfrey has to worry about systemic racism in her day-to-day life? Do you think Barack Obama has to worry about systemic racism in his day-to-day life? Of course not. It's not a coincidence that many of the loudest black voices denying the existence of systemic racism were either born well off or lucky enough to escape poverty. In fact, several experts argue that a universal basic income could help end systemic racism by breaking people out of the vicious cycle of poverty. And it's kind of sad that I have to say this, but we don't want equality of outcome. We want equal opportunity. And systemic racism is still, in the year 2024, preventing that from happening. Today, if you are a person of color, especially born in the United States, with the data we have, we can predict that it's much more likely that you will end up living a shorter life, getting a worse education and crappier job opportunities, not being able to buy a house, getting less political representation, and end up in prison. Let's return to the perhaps cringy metaphor that I brought up before. There are people in the hole who have to climb out first before they have the same opportunities as the rest of us. Systemic racism caused people of color to be in that hole in the first place. History tells us how that hole got there. And sure, our laws likely prevent new holes from forming, but dadgummit, those holes are still there. The rest of us, the people on the ground, need to stop pretending like there isn't a hole and that there aren't people down in it. We need to stop telling the people down in the hole to just climb out and join the rest of us. No, man. The people in the hole need a ladder, need a rope, something to help them. And just because some do make it out of the hole and get plenty of apples, doesn't mean the hole isn't there and doesn't mean the problem doesn't exist. That's the apple picking fallacy after all. I mean, cherry picking fallacy. At the very least, let's recognize that many of us were privileged enough to not start out in the hole. And we're not better because we didn't begin life in the hole. We were freaking lucky. Many are poor not because they are lazy, not because they are addicted to drugs, not because they don't value education. They're poor because they can't escape the history of their ancestors. I think we should help them escape it. I leaned heavily on 4 books researching for this video. Jonathan Kozol's classic book, Savage Inequalities, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, and finally a newer one called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I've linked all these books in the description of this video. I encourage you to read these yourself, research all this stuff on your own. Don't just believe every word I say. That all said, I've also linked all my sources in the description of this video. Really looking forward to the comments on this one. Thanks for watching.